The monarchy provides, with the constitution, a degree of long-term stability that is actually quite hard to come by any other way.
It was meant to be her private escape, her summer sanctuary inside the historic grounds of Sandringham House, a place tied deeply to royal memory, tradition, and the private rhythm of the crown. But this year, something changed. The gates at once opened without question, stayed locked, and waiting on the other side was Queen Camilla. There was no public announcement, no ceremonial explanation, just a quiet legal action that spread through the estate like shockwaves through stone corridors. Staff were confused. Security hesitated. And within hours, rumors began to circle a name that rarely moves without consequence: Princess Anne. The sealed order reportedly carried her private legal authorization, delivered through formal counsel rather than palace communication channels. It was precise, silent, final. One section of the estate, the eastern wing traditionally associated with private royal retreats, was restricted without exception. And in that moment, a question echoed across the monarchy. This was not just about access, it was about control. For years, Sandringham had been more than a residence. It was a seasonal refuge for generations of the royal family, especially during the winter months when official duties slowed and private life briefly returned. Under Queen Elizabeth II, it represented continuity, a place where hierarchy softened and family replaced formality. But continuity is not immunity from change. Camilla's relationship with royal residences evolved significantly after her rise in status. As queen consort, she gained access to spaces once reserved for sovereign tradition. Yet access in monarchy is never just about permission. It is about perception. And perception inside royal walls is shaped by history as much as law. The sudden restriction of the Sandringham wing therefore carried weight far beyond property lines. It signaled a shift in internal boundaries, a reminder that even within the crown's most private spaces, authority is constantly negotiated. According to internal whispers, the legal action was not arbitrary. It followed months of quiet restructuring within royal estate management. Advisors had been reviewing usage patterns, security classifications, and generational access protocols. What emerged was a growing effort to redefine private royal space, not as inherited entitlement, but as assigned responsibility. That shift placed certain long-standing traditions under pressure. Witnesses described confusion among staff when the directive was first enforced. Some believed it to be temporary maintenance scheduling. Others thought it was a miscommunication between estate officers. But when official legal seals were confirmed, uncertainty turned into silence. No one questioned it aloud, because within royal systems, silence often speaks louder than instruction. Meanwhile, inside the broader monarchy, tensions were already rising around modernization and internal restructuring led by King Charles III. The institution has been steadily moving toward a smaller, more defined working structure, one that concentrates duty among a reduced circle of senior royals. In that environment, access to estates like Sandringham becomes more than symbolic. It becomes strategic. The eastern wing in question had long been used for private seasonal stays, informal gatherings, family retreats, and quiet moments away from public duty. Restricting it was not just a logistical decision. It was a redefinition of who belongs in those private rhythms of royal life. And that is where the story becomes personal. Because for Camilla, these spaces represent more than heritage. They represent acceptance, a place within a system that has historically measured belonging with strict precision. To be excluded, even temporarily, is not just inconvenience. It is message. Inside palace corridors, analysts reportedly began framing the event in colder terms: boundary enforcement, access recalibration, and symbolic containment. But outside those walls, the interpretation was far more emotional. Why now? Why this space? Why this method? Supporters of the decision point to procedural clarity, that estates must be managed under updated governance standards. Critics argue it reflects internal friction between traditional authority structures and evolving roles within the royal household. And standing quietly in the middle of it all is Princess Anne, a figure long associated with discipline, precision, and an uncompromising sense of duty. Unlike more public-facing royals, her influence rarely appears through spectacle. It appears through structure. That is what makes a situation so significant, because structural decisions are rarely reversed. As the day unfolded, the atmosphere around Sandringham reportedly settled into controlled stillness. The gates remained closed, the restricted wing remained sealed, and life inside the estate continued under a new, unspoken understanding that access had changed, and with it, expectation. By evening, the story had already transformed from rumor into narrative. Royal commentators debated intent. Historians compared precedent. Social media amplified speculation into certainty. But within the estate itself, nothing was said. Only the presence of absence remained. And perhaps that is the most defining feature of modern monarchy, not what is announced publicly, but what is quietly reclassified behind closed doors. Because sometimes power does not announce itself with crowns or speeches. Sometimes it appears as a locked gate at a familiar place, and the realization that even the most trusted sanctuaries are still subject to change. As night settled over Sandringham House, the estate returned to silence. But the meaning of that silence had shifted. What was once a summer retreat had become something else entirely, a reminder that in the royal world, no space is ever permanently open, and no privilege is ever beyond reconsideration. And in that quiet closure, a new chapter of royal balance had already begun. The silence after the lockdown at Sandringham House did not feel like calm. It felt like pressure building under glass. Every corridor, every gate, every sealed doorway carried the weight of a decision that no one in the household could openly challenge. What had begun as a simple restriction on one wing of the estate was now being interpreted as something far more deliberate, a redefinition of who was allowed to occupy royal space without question. And at the center of that interpretation stood Queen Camilla, who until that moment had moved through royal residences with the quiet confidence of someone who understood her place in the system. That confidence had now been disrupted, not publicly, not officially, but structurally. Inside palace networks tied to King Charles III, the incident was reportedly categorized under the state access restructuring. A neutral phrase on paper. But within royal circles, neutral language often hides the most sensitive shifts in power, because access in monarchy is never just about geography. It is about permission to belong. And permission, once questioned, is never entirely stable again. What made this moment more significant was the method. There was no announcement, no press briefing, no visible confrontation. Instead, the change arrived through legal enforcement, precise, quiet, and immediate. The kind of action that does not invite discussion, only acknowledgement. According to internal accounts, the directive linked to the office of princess and was not framed as personal intervention, but as custodial enforcement of a state protocol. That distinction matters deeply inside royal governance, because it separates authority from opinion. Authority can be executed without debate. Opinion cannot. And what unfolded at Sandringham was treated as authority. Staff members reportedly described the atmosphere as frozen activity, movement continuing, but conversation reduced. Tasks were completed, but questions were not asked. Everyone understood that something permanent had been adjusted, even if no one had been told the full reason. That is how the monarchy often operates in its most sensitive moments. Through understanding, not explanation. Through compliance, not clarity. The sealed eastern wing itself carries symbolic weight. Historically, parts of Sandringham have been used as private retreats for senior members of the royal family during seasonal stays, particularly under the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. These spaces were not just rooms. They were traditions, inherited patterns of movement, rest, and family gathering. To restrict one of those spaces is not simply to close a door. It is to interrupt a pattern. And patterns inside royal institutions are deeply protected, even when they are not publicly acknowledged. This is why the reaction within the household was so immediate, because everyone understood the unspoken implication. If a space tied to long-standing royal routine can be restricted without public negotiation, then no space is fully permanent. For Queen Camilla, the situation became more complex because it touched not just access, but perception. Within monarchy, perception often carries more influence than formal rank, and perception is shaped by continuity, by who is seen where, and when, and under what conditions. Being present is one thing. Being granted presence is another. That distinction is what turned a logistical restriction into a symbolic event. Meanwhile, internal discussions reportedly expanded beyond Sandringham itself. Advisors close to the royal household began reassessing estate classifications across multiple properties. Questions emerged about seasonal usage, private access rights, and the long-term structure of royal retreats. In other words, Sandringham may not have been the end point. It may have been the starting point. Within this evolving framework, the influence of Princess becomes more significant. Known for her disciplined approach to royal duty and a preference for structure over sentiment, she has long been associated with decisions that prioritize stability over tradition when the two come into conflict. That reputation is what makes a current situation so sensitive, because it suggests intent, not emotional reaction, not misunderstanding, but design. And design inside monarchy carries consequences that extend far beyond a single estate. By the time the public became aware that something unusual had occurred, the narrative had already fragmented into competing interpretations. Some framed it as internal estate management. Others viewed it as a quiet assertion of boundaries within the royal family. Others still saw it as part of a larger modernization effort underway under King Charles III. But all interpretations agreed on one thing. This was not random. This was structured. And structure, once introduced, tends to expand. As evening approached, the physical environment of Sandringham remained unchanged. The same trees lined the same paths. The same walls held the same history. But the meaning attached to those spaces had shifted, because the eastern wing was no longer just part of an estate. It had become a boundary marker, a reminder that access is conditional, and conditions can be rewritten at any time. For Camilla, the emotional dimension of that shift was not about confrontation or conflict. It was about realization, the realization that even long-standing familiarity does not guarantee permanence, that spaces once entered freely can become restricted without warning, and that within monarchy, stability is often an illusion maintained by agreement, not certainty. And yet, through all the tension, one deeper truth emerges beneath the surface narrative. The monarchy is not only a family, it is an operating system. And like any system, it evolves through updates that are not always announced in advance. Sometimes those updates are visible, coronations, ceremonies, public declarations, and sometimes they are not. Sometimes they appear as quiet legal seals on a closed wing of an estate. As night settled once again over Sandringham House, the estate did not feel disrupted anymore. It felt recalibrated. And in that recalibration lies the essence of the story, not a single act of exclusion, but a broader reminder that within the royal world, nothing is permanently fixed. Not access, not tradition, not even comfort. Because when structure changes silently, the most powerful impact is not what is seen at the gates, but what is felt long after they close. The following morning at Sandringham House, nothing looked unusual from the outside. The gardens were still perfectly maintained. The gravel paths were still swept with precision. The estate staff still moved with quiet efficiency, as if nothing had shifted at all. But inside that stillness, something fundamental had changed. Because once a boundary is drawn in a place like this, even silence begins to feel different. And that is exactly what the enforcement around the eastern wing had created. Not noise, not conflict, but awareness. A constant reminder that access, even within the most familiar spaces, is never guaranteed. For Queen Camilla, the situation had reportedly evolved from confusion into reflection. Palace sources describe a response not as confrontation, but as recalibration, a quiet reassessment of how quickly stability inside the royal environment can shift without warning. There were no public statements, no visible reaction, but within the internal rhythm of royal life, absence of response is often its own form of communication. Meanwhile, within the broader structure overseen by King Charles III, the situation was being carefully contained. The language used in internal briefings remained deliberately neutral: estate compliance, access adjustment, procedural enforcement. But neutrality inside monarchy does not erase meaning. It only compresses it, and compressed meaning tends to spread in unexpected ways. Across royal circles, discussion quietly expanded beyond Sandringham itself. Advisors began reviewing how private wings across multiple estates were categorized. What began as a single restriction was now being analyzed as a potential precedent, because precedent is what transforms a single decision into a system-wide shift. And systems, once adjusted, rarely return to their original form. At the center of this recalibration, the influence of Princess continued to be a focal point of interpretation. known for a disciplined approach to institutional responsibility, Anne's role in royal operations has often been described less in emotional terms and more in structural ones. She does not typically change how people feel. She changes how things function, and that distinction is what makes her involvement in any estate-level enforcement so significant, because it signals intention rooted in order, not reaction. Within Sandringham itself, staff reportedly began adjusting routines without instruction. Access routes were subtly altered. Movement near the restricted wing became more cautious. Conversations, already minimal, became even more precise. Not because anyone was told to, but because everyone understood the tone of the change. That is how hierarchy behaves when it is reinforced without words. The Eastern Wing, once associated with seasonal familiarity and informal royal retreat, now carried a different presence. Doors remained closed. Entry remained restricted. And even when physically unchanged, it no longer felt like part of the same internal geography. It had become a line, not visible on maps, but understood by those who worked there. And lines, once understood, tend to reshape behavior far more effectively than rules ever do. For Queen Camilla, the deeper impact of the situation was not about the space itself, but about what it represented. The realization that proximity to tradition does not guarantee permanence within it. In monarchy, closeness is not ownership, and familiarity is not immunity. Every role exists within conditions that can shift when the institution decides they must. As the day progressed, attention outside the estate intensified again. Analysts debated whether the restriction represented a broader restructuring of royal property governance under King Charles III. Some suggested it reflected an effort to streamline estate usage. Others saw it as a symbolic reinforcement of internal hierarchy. But those inside the system understood something more subtle. This was not about reduction. It was about definition. Who defines space defines role. And who defines role defines influence. That is why even a single sealed wing can carry implications far beyond its walls. By late afternoon, the atmosphere at Sandringham had settled into controlled normality again. The same routines resumed. The same quiet movement returned. But beneath it all, a new layer of awareness remained, a permanent understanding that something had shifted, even if nothing more was said. And that understanding is what gives the story its weight. Because in institutions like this, change rarely announces itself twice. It happens once, and then it becomes a new baseline. As dusk returned over Sandringham House, the estate lights flickered on across long corridors and empty gardens. The restricted wing remained dark, unchanged, and sealed, not as punishment, not as spectacle, but as structure. And structure, once established, rarely needs reinforcement. It simply remains, quiet, unquestioned, and powerful in its silence, because in the end, the most defining shift inside the royal world are not the ones that alter appearances, but the ones that quietly redraw the limits of where anyone is allowed to stand.